In this tutorial, I'll show you how to blend color digitally in just about any digital art application. That's coming up next. Thanks for joining me today. I'm digital artist Aaron Rutten, and it is my mission to help artists like you enjoy digital art and learn some new skills along the way. That's why today we're going to be talking about color blending. Now first, I want to differentiate between blending color with a blender and getting blends of color by building up semi-opaque layers of paint. So here in this example, I'm putting down two solid colors, and then we can select a blender. Now I'm using Corel Painter in this example, but I'm going to show you how to blend in other digital art applications as well. The blender that I'm going to choose is called Just Add Water, and to blend, you simply just paint in between two colors to create a blend of the two colors mixed together. Now if I hold Alt and I sample that color, you can see that it is right in between the red and the yellow. Now I can essentially get that same result if I go ahead and just put down that same yellow-orange, but this time I'm going to go ahead and use a semi-opaque airbrush first, and then I'll sample that red color, and I'll use light pressure just to fade it into that yellow-orange, and then on the other side I'll use heavier pressure to make it a bit more thick. So now I have that transition of the orange in between the yellow and the red. So while you can make color blends with semi-opaque brushes, it's just going to be more difficult. So just use blenders, that's what they're there for. This tutorial is going to focus more on blending using the blenders, but near the end of this tutorial I will show you a few alternative ways to blend as well. If your art application does not have blenders, then get a free one that does, like Krita for example, and then bounce your artwork between the two apps using the PSD file format or another layered format. Next we'll take a look at some of the blenders that are available in some of the various art applications. Now for me, blending is huge. I need to have adequate blenders in my art application. Some applications only have a blur or a smudge tool, and that just doesn't cut it. Now, in my opinion, Corel Painter has some of the best blenders. Let's go ahead and take a look at Diffuse Blur. That gives you a nice grainy blend. Let's try Coarse Oily Blender, and that gives you a more coarse blend that kind of mixes the pixels together and gives you more texture. We already looked at Just Add Water. Let's try Coarse Smear Blender Jitter. That gives us a nice oily broken blend. Now let's try Smooth Knife Blender. That gives us a nice oily looking result here. Works really well for getting that traditional paint look. Now some of these are custom brushes I created and some of them are default brushes, but you can see that there's no one way to blend. There's a lot of different ways. Now let's jump on over to Photoshop and take a look at some of the blenders. We can try the mixer brush, and if we blend right in between these two colors, it kind of mixes and blends the colors together. But not quite the best blender here in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and switch to Kyle's Paintbox Wet Blender, and that'll do a much better job of blending. Just recently, Photoshop has added a lot of nice blender brushes, and so while it wasn't so good in the past, it's much better now for blending. Well, it gives you a nice wet effect. If you want some other blenders in Photoshop, you can just search for any brush that has the word blender in it, such as this Impressionist blender here. This will give us nice individual little paint dabs, kind of like an Impressionist painting. Next, we'll move on to Medibang Paint Pro. So Medibang has blur and it has smudge. Let's try blur first. And if we paint in between these two colors, it's really just blurring the pixels. It's not actually blending or anything like that. Let's try smudge, and that's really not much better. It's just smudging and not really blending. So Medibang Paint Pro really fails at having adequate blenders. The closest thing you'll be able to get to blending is to select the watercolor brushes and then just use very light pen pressure to try to fade your colors together like so. Moving on to PaintTool SAI, this is another application that does not have any blenders. However, you can select your watercolor brush and you can sample a color and try to fade it into another color, and you'll get something that looks like blending but technically is not a blender. If we go ahead and paint on an empty part of the canvas, you can see that it's adding paint. So a true blender will not add paint, it will only blend paint. So PaintTool SAI also fails at having adequate blenders. So how about ClipStudio Paint Pro? Can we blend in ClipStudio Paint? Let's go ahead and look in the Blender tool. And we have several presets. Let's try Blend. And we get this nice wet blend, kind of similar to what we were getting with Just Add Water in Corel Painter. If we use a bigger blender, we're going to get a bigger, broader blend. If we use a smaller brush, then we'll get a finer blend that might not be as smooth. Let's try Blur now. And Blur looks very similar. I don't know if I really see much of a difference there. Let's try Fingertip. This is more of a smudge brush. It's kind of smudging rather than blending. Let's try Running Color on Fiber, and that gives us kind of a wet splattery effect. I really like the way that this one looks. It gives you a little bit of texture while you're blending. And we'll try Soothing Watercolor. And to me, this looks more like oil paint or acrylic, but it gives you that nice traditional blending look. This is a great blender. Copy Stamp is not actually a blender, so we'll skip that one. So ClipStudio Paint actually has some pretty decent blenders. Now we'll move on to Rebelle and see what kind of blenders it has to offer. There is a blender brush tool and a smudge tool. Let's start with blender brush, and there's a preset for soft and hard. And this gives us kind of a wet blend, similar to that Just Add Water and the first blender we looked at in ClipStudio Paint. Let's try the smudge tool. This has 3 presets. This one is smudge, and it gives us that nice textured, oily blend while smudging at the same time. Let's try smudge 2. This is very similar to smudge 1. I can't say I see much of a difference. Let's try soft, and this is just a straight up smudge tool. So these are really smudging more than they're actually blending. Now you might notice that mixing yellow and blue does not make green like it does in real life painting. It's actually making kind of an ugly gray color, and this is because color on a computer is completely different than color on a canvas. I'll explain why a little bit later in this tutorial. One thing that's particularly cool about Rebelle is that you can paint with your pen, and then you can use your finger to blend if your tablet supports touch input. That's a really cool, very intuitive feature that I like a lot. So I would say that Rebelle just barely squeaks by and has adequate blenders. There aren't a whole lot of default presets, but it's not very difficult to make your own blenders. Now let's give Krita a try. Krita has quite a few blenders. Let's try Blender Basic. This gives us kind of a wet, semi-oily kind of blending look. Works really well to blend those colors together. Let's try Blender Blur. A much softer, more even, smoother result. Gives you a really nice blend to where you can barely see where one color ends and begins. Blender Knife Edge gives you that rough, more grainy look. Blender Pixelize is a very interesting brush because it kind of pixelizes your colors or turns them into little squares. Then there's Blender Rake, which you can use to kind of rake in, and that's more of a smudge, I guess. There's a Blender Smear, another smudge tool, and then Blender Textured Soft, a really great, very organic looking blender. So Krita has actually improved quite a bit as far as having adequate blenders. I would say that it's a pretty good application to use for blending, namely because it's free, and if you wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, you can always move your artwork into Krita, do your blending here, and then move back to your other application and continue painting. If we look at the open file options, you can see there's a lot of formats that are supported, namely the Photoshop PSD file format and the TIFF format, which are both layered file formats, so you should be able to use those to bounce artwork back and forth. And last but not least, we'll give ArtRage a try. If we click on the palette knife tool, that'll give us a bunch of presets we can use to blend. Let's go ahead and try blurred frosting up here at the top. And this gives us kind of a wet effect. We're going to want to use a much bigger brush here. That'll make it more obvious. And you might notice that it's making green when it's mixing blue and yellow. And I know I said earlier that that doesn't happen on the computer, but in ArtRage, if you go to Tools, Color Options, there's an option to set this to Real Color Blending, which does an okay job of simulating how colors should mix, but it's not perfect. Let's try the Hard Out Smudge preset. I think this is my favorite blender overall in ArtRage because it gives you that nice, thick, oily look, and it kind of builds up the paint and globs it together. Looks really nice. Let's try Hard Wet Blender, and you can see that some of these blenders look very similar, so I'm not going to go through absolutely all of these. I'll just show you a few real quick so you can get an idea of what they're going to do. This one works better if the brush is much larger, so that ought to give you a good idea of the blenders that are available in ArtRage. ArtRage has some pretty good blenders. So out of all these applications, Corel Painter is my favorite because its blenders look the best, and it's very easy to create your own blenders, and there's just so many different blending results that you can get. So here in Corel Painter, I have some color swatches, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into blending. I'm going to go ahead and select the Just Add Water blender, and I'm going to try blending some of these swatches. Now, some colors are going to blend together more easily than other colors. For example, if I want to blend this red with this orange, I can just paint right in between the two colors, and I get a really nice smooth blend, and you can't tell where one color ends and the other begins. If we compare that to trying to blend the yellow with the blue, then we get that really ugly gray color, and that's because yellow and blue are not very close to each other. If we look up in our color wheel here, we can see that this red and this orange, they're right next to each other on the hue ring here. So you don't have to move very far to go from red to orange. If we compare that to blue and yellow, blue is on the opposite side of the color wheel from yellow, so they're as far away as possible. So the way that computer color works is any colors that are opposite to each other here on the color wheel are going to mix to gray. So the closer together the colors are on the hue ring, or in value, that's lightness to darkness, or in saturation, the easier they're going to be to blend. If the colors are very different from each other, then they're going to be very difficult to blend. So what do we do if we want to blend this yellow and this blue together? Well, we need to create some intermediate colors in between. So if I wanted to move from yellow here in the hue ring all the way down to this blue, then we need to move from one color to the next until we get there. But we don't want to go to the left because then we go through red and pink and that's not going to look natural. We want to go the opposite direction and we want to go on the cool side and go from blue through cyan to green and then back to yellow. That'll give us a much more natural looking transition. So I'll start by grabbing this slightly cyan blue and I'll put in some of that. Then I'll put in some aqua. Then I'll put in some green next to that. And then I'll select kind of a lime yellowish green and I'll put in some of that. And now we have some transitional or intermediate colors. And we can select our blender, blend in between those colors, and then we get a much smoother, much more natural looking transition. So if I blend these swatches together now using that Just Add Water brush and a very big brush, then I can get a very nice, very smooth blend between all of these colors. A much smoother blend than I'd get if I tried to blend that yellow right into the blue. I just get that ugly gray color. Next, we'll talk a little bit about mixing colors. Some blenders mix color and some blenders mix pixels. And what I mean by that is if we select Just Add Water, this is blending the color. It's creating intermediate colors when you blend. If we compare that to something like Diffuse Blur here, this is just going to kind of scramble the pixels up. From far away, it looks like it's blended the two colors together and created intermediate colors, but if we zoom in very closely, you can see that it's just shuffled the pixels. It doesn't really create intermediate colors in the same way. Just as well, I can select the Coarse Oily Blender, and this also kind of mixes the pixels up. It doesn't really create intermediate colors, but this may be the kind of look that you want, because as I mentioned earlier, there's no one way to blend. There's lots of different blending effects that you can get. So you may want that more coarse textured look, or you might want a softer, smoother look that creates intermediate colors, or you might want to use a mix of both. Some blenders can even be sensitive to pen pressure. For example, Diffuse Blur, if I use very, very firm pressure, then I'm really going to scramble those pixels up. However, if I use very, very light pressure, then it's just going to fuzz things up a little bit, and it works more similarly to a blur kind of brush where it's not really scrambling things, it's just kind of softening them. As I begin to increase the pressure on my brush, I'll start to get more and more of that blending effect. Next, I want to talk a little bit about texture, because you can create texture in your work by blending. I'm going to select Coarse Oily Blender, and I get that nice coarse result when I blend, and that creates texture. So rather than using brushes to paint in that texture, I can simply blend to create that texture. Let's try the Grainy Blender. This will also create a bit of texture when we blend. We can control this texture pattern by changing our paper here in Corel Painter. So I can choose Simulated Wood Grain. Now I get a more rocky texture. If I change it to something like Pebble Board, then I get something like this. And I can control the scale of that texture here in the paper properties and all kinds of things like rotation and contrast. It gives me a lot of control over the kind of blend that I'm getting. Now this would be considered a coarse blender because it's creating that nice, sharp, coarse texture. If we compared that to something like the Smooth Knife Blender, then this is more of a smooth blending. There aren't really a lot of sharp edges. It's very nice and smooth and soft, and you get something that looks a little more painterly. Next, we'll move on and we'll discuss blending to transparency. Some applications have blenders that will let you blend on separate layers, and your blending can blend to alpha or to transparency, meaning that the pixels get transparent as you blend them. So for example, I can create a new layer, paint this blue dot. I can select a blender like Coarse Smear Blender Jitter, and then as I blend, those pixels that are getting blended are becoming slightly transparent. This is the kind of natural result that you'd get if you were blending real paint in real life. The paint would get a little bit more transparent as it starts to blend out. Now we can see more clearly how this is working if we take the layer and move it around. You can see that the edges are indeed more transparent. Now, not all art applications can blend to transparency. Some will only let you blend if you're painting on a layer that already has paint on it. Some will only add paint while blending. So this is yet another reason why I prefer Corel Painter. Now in Corel Painter, you'll want to go to the window menu, look under brush control panels, and then choose blending, because there is a setting called enhanced layer blending that can help with the white fringe that might appear along the edges when you blend. You want to make sure that this is checked for any brush that can support it, because that's going to ensure that any white edges get turned into transparency. I'm going to select the Diffuse Blur Blender, and I'll show you what I mean by white edges. Diffuse blur does not support enhanced layer blending, so if I blend with this brush, then it's adding white to the edges. Now, if I go ahead and move this around, you can see that it's got this white halo around it, and it kind of ruins everything. Fortunately, what you can do to get rid of that is just change the composite method to gel cover, and that white disappears. Now, while it is nice to be able to blend to transparency, you may find that it can be a little tedious when you have a lot of layers to have to switch back and forth between all the different layers to blend them. It may be easier to wait till the end of your painting to do some of your major blending to blend things together, and then just merge all of your layers together and then do your blending. That way you'll be blending all of your layers simultaneously. You do want to make sure that you go ahead and go to Save As and save a copy of your work before you merge your layers. That way if you ever need to go back to the layered version, you can do that. Now let's discuss some alternative methods of blending color together. For example, you can change the composite method or the blend mode of a layer to change how it blends with the colors underneath it. For example, I'll change this blue dot layer to multiply, and now the paint changes from an opaque paint that covers everything to a semi-transparent paint that blends darker with all of the colors that are underneath. So if I take it and I move it around, you can see how it affects all of the other colors that are underneath it. Now if I move it up here to the white, it doesn't look like anything's happening. If I move it to the black, it disappears, and that's because black can't get any blacker than black. And if I move it over, let's say, to the yellow, it looks kind of greenish. If I move it over towards the blue, then it just becomes invisible because I can't make blue any more blue. Now I can choose the composite method called screen, and that kind of does the opposite. It blends everything lighter. So if I hover over the purple, it's a lighter purple. If I hover over the blues, it's a lighter blue. White does nothing because I can't make white any brighter. If I go over to black, then it just looks blue again. I'm going to go ahead and change the composite method of the blend mode back to multiply. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to paint in a little bit of red here in the center, and I'll change that to the screen composite method. Now, one potential downside to working this way is if you merge two composite method layers that are different together, then they turn into a default layer, and if you try to change that default layer back into multiply or back into screen, then you don't get quite the same result that you were getting before. So what we'll have to do is back up a bit here till our layers are separate, and then drop or merge all of our layers together. Now we'll be able to blend it without the appearance changing too much. Another way to blend colors is to utilize your color sampler. Most art applications will have a dropper tool like this, and some art applications will even let you change the point sample size. So I'm going to change this from point sample to 100 by 100 average, and then if I click right in between two colors, it's going to average those two colors together to create a blend. You can see in the color picker here, it created an orange. Now if I select my brush and I paint right in between those two colors, then I get this nice intermediate color. If I go back to my dropper again, which I can actually do just by holding Alt on my keyboard, then I can sample between those two colors, select my brush and paint, and now I get a mixture of those two colors. I can sample on the other side, and I get a mixture of those two colors. And I can keep going until I get a very nice, smooth transition between all of the colors. So that's essentially just like blending, but not quite as intuitive. Another way to blend colors is by using a gradient. For example, I'm going to go ahead and select my lasso selection tool, and I'll just make a selection here within my lines. I've gone ahead and created an additional layer beneath the lines for color, and then I'll go ahead and select my gradient tool here. I'll select a preset, then I'll select the circular gradient, and I'll drag out my gradient. I want to go ahead and just flip the direction here so that the colors are going the opposite direction. Then I'll just edit the gradient a bit to get it looking the way that I want. Click on the check to commit, and there you go. You have a nice blend of color without ever having to pick up a blender. Moving on to the next method, I have this nice flat green color here on a color layer beneath the lines. I'm going to turn on lock transparency or preserve transparency on that color layer. And then I'm going to select an airbrush that's set to a low opacity. I'll select a brighter green color, make a really big brush here, and just use light pressure to kind of fade this in to create that nice transition. I can use a smaller brush if I want kind of a more opaque highlight there. So sometimes it can be faster just to go ahead and paint in these transitions in color rather than blending them with a blender. And we'll look at one final method for blending color. I have that same flat color that I put down, but this time I'll go ahead and put down some brighter colors stacked on top of each other. And I'm just using a flat, fully opaque brush. Now I'll go to Effects, Focus, Soften, also known as Gaussian blur in other art applications. And I can just increase the amount until I get a nice blending of that color. So there you go. That's an in-depth look at how to blend color digitally. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video, And if you're enjoying all these free digital art tutorials that I'm posting to YouTube, go on over to patreon.com/AaronRutton and join me on my mission to create more digital art resources like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.